Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Do we have a separate microphone? Okay, there we go. I first ran into 2600 back in 2011 when I was the Chief Technology Officer for a company called Five9, which is a cloud contact center company. How I ran into him is there was this gentleman there named Josh, I believe, if I remember. So Patrick and Josh were at a communications conference, and Josh was yelling at the CEO of Sprint about how telecommunications needs to be this better thing and some new way of doing things. It was kind of fascinating to see this guy in the back row just hollering at the CEO. Afterwards, I tracked him down and said, I'm really interested in what you guys are doing. And that's when I first got involved with 2600, as the CTO at Five9. We use that technology and so forth. A little bit about my background. I've been in the contact center space about 25 years now. Started my first software company in '95. We did IVR applications, interactive voice response systems. After that, I had a hosted IVR company, and after that, I had a BPO company where we had about 15,000 agents across the United States and the Philippines. A bit after that, that's when I became the CTO at Five9. We grew that from 20 million to about 100 million, took it public in 2014. After that, I became the Vice President General Manager at Avaya. So I had about 72,000 contact center customers. We had somewhere around 4.7 million agents on all of our customer platform across the globe. And then after that, I did some work at the Stanford Research Institute around artificial intelligence technology, which is a big thing for me now. That's what I'm really, really fascinated by. And then more recently, I was the CEO of another cloud contact center company called Serenova. So what I was asked to present today is, just kind of what's the history of contact centers, where they started, how they started, where they are today, and where they're going next. Please feel free to ask me any questions during the presentation. I'll try to make it under the wire so that you guys can get out of here and get to lunch. It's always fun being the last presenter just before lunch. Sort of thing. And if you are really, really hungry, it won't offend me if you go get food right away, sort of thing. So a little bit, let's see here. I guess I'll have to use that. Okay, so a little bit about contact centers. One of the key things to remember about contact centers or call centers is they're all about efficiency, right? Because contact centers are typically the bastard child of a company, right? You put money into a group and it's their job is to basically answer questions for customers, and most of the time customers just don't want to invest into that. So they've been around for quite some time and have learned how to spend as little money as possible with delivering the highest quality and the most answers to customers as possible. So it's a very interesting business to be in because of that fact over time. Now, how did contact centers come about? So if you think about, technology has been changing the world. And when I talk about changing the world, think about if you go back 200-300 years, right? If you think about technology back then, everything was manufactured piece by piece. Someone sat there and they built something and they made something by hand because that's all the technology that we had. After that, we kind of grew up and we learned how to work with metal, and we started building machines that made it possible for us to produce more and more things with fewer and fewer people. Over time, those machines became even more efficient so that we could produce more and more whatever the products and goods were with fewer and fewer people, right? And so it's this evolution of building things, making it more and more efficient, to where we are finally, where information itself becomes important, right? So there's a transition in our history of the world over roughly the last 100 years, that where we go from we're just making things to where information becomes very, very important. And that transition is important to understand when you talk about contact centers. Because as I was talking before, right, if you think about the models that followed our evolution as a society, right? So the first model was individual things were made, so there was not a whole lot of stuff to be sold in a sense, right? Because you couldn't produce so much. So the original business models were basically stores, right? Where you only went to buy something, and if you didn't make it yourself, when you absolutely needed it, right? So that's talking about the stores and the shops, where you go buy your goods. Building managers, if you lived in a city and you lived in a building, the managers are the one that came and got your rent money, right, from you. Brokers and bankers, if you wanted a loan or something like that, you actually had to go to the banker wherever the heck the banker was. It could be hundreds of miles or even 1,000 miles away, depending upon where you lived in the country. So the second is, as we started to develop more and more retail goods, and we started to mature as a society, not only could society still have this idea to go buy things, but through that advance in technologies, things started to be removed away, basically from that face-to-face interaction. So your building manager no longer came to you for rent, you mailed it to him. You started to buy things like electricity or phone services, and you mailed those bills in instead of going someplace and actually making a payment for that. We still had the stores and so forth, but it's that kind of remote type business that really started to take hold in our country, believe it or not, in around the 40s, the mid 40s to early 50s. So it's very new kind of concepts that are going on that we're talking about here. And finally, if you think about where we are today, we're turning very much into a disconnected society when it comes to products and goods and so forth. That disconnected society is this idea is, now if I want to buy something, I just pull out my phone and right? I don't have to go to a store. I don't have to really use my phone to call for something or so forth. So that disconnected society is just an example of how we are ramping up the speed of how we do commerce and how we interact with each other and so forth. And it's that speed is what's important to understand and how contact centers come into play. So basically, as in the early days, again, it was all face-to-face and so forth. It was all low transactions, low latency. There really wasn't a need for the concept of a call center, because basically, if you had a problem with something, you sent a letter, and 3 weeks later, that letter made it to someone, and someone worked on it and responded to you, a month later or 2 months later. So society was much, much slower then. In fact, managers in businesses are the ones that answered it. In fact, there was a time where if you had a problem, you sent them a letter, and it would go to the CEO of a company or the president of the company, which is, back then, you could do. But as we grew as a society and there's more and more transactions, people buying more and more stuff, and the amount of latency or time that people wanted to hear responses started to shrink dramatically, right? So if you, in the 30s and the 40s, if you went to your Sears store, basically, and bought something and it didn't work, you're going to want an answer as to why it didn't work right away. And right away, back then, was like in a week or two, right? We're talking about long periods of time to us, but back then it was very quickly. So then finally, you talk about what's going on today in the disconnected business world. It's basically this idea of massive transactions, right? So the world we live in today is there are just billions of transactions occurring every single day, and those transactions have some sort of data or interaction with it that customers want to understand what's going on. So if I'm using my Uber app, for example, I'm using that interaction. If I'm buying soap for my house now, I don't go to a store typically, I just go on to Amazon, I click, 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 and hit enter, and off it comes to me eventually. And if you'll notice in the case of Amazon, even that's speeding up, right? When Amazon first started, if you bought some soap and you got it in 2 days, that's great. But now Amazon's building an infrastructure so that when you order soap or something like that, it comes to your house within a few hours. That's that whole drone delivery system and so forth, as an example. So our society is just continuing to speed up, speed up, and speed up. So what that results today is that we have a contact center business or people who answer those transactions, who answer those calls, of about 15 million people on the globe today. 15 million people that sit in front of a phone, they take a phone call, they take some other interaction and work with you. Now the $24 billion global addressable market, I'll talk about that at the end, but that's basically how much money businesses are spending every year on just the technology, not on people, not on buildings, not on long distance, just the technology itself. So it's a pretty big market that we're talking about here. So when you think about the fact that these transactions are speeding up and so forth, one of the key things for contact centers is keeping a balance between the cost of running that contact center and the quality of those phone calls. If you think about when contact centers really started to ramp up, it was in the 70s and 80s, and trying to balance exactly how I handle those calls, how I treat those customers, which just became a very important thing for managing that cost. So some of the things in the contact center that you look at are, what's your average speed to answer? That's how long it takes you to answer the phone call, how long that customer sits on hold. Your average handle time, how long do you actually talk to that customer when they're on the phone? Your average, your first call resolution. So do I fix this problem right at the beginning, or is there a problem afterwards? Attrition. Agent attrition is basically the agents get frustrated and they quit, right? Which is very expensive because you think about how much it costs to train them and so forth. So contact centers are constantly balancing between those two. You know, if I have a higher average speed to answer, which means I let customers wait on the call longer, then I don't need as many agents, right? Because customers are waiting longer, and so agents will take calls as they come through. So that lowers my costs. But if I choose as a business to say, nope, I don't want people holding on calls, like for example, American Express has an average speed of answer sub 3 seconds, you need a lot more people, right? And if you don't have those people, then you're gonna wait. So it's that balance that's really, really important for contact centers. And they've been working on this balance for 60 years. And so when I talked about at the beginning that contact centers are about efficiency, it's because of that reason. Businesses tell contact centers you have X amount of dollars to spend and that's it. So they've been working on ways and tools for the last, like I said, 60, 70 years on how to take those limited dollars and become the most efficient with it. As part of that, some of the tools and processes, and again, please, if anyone has any questions about these things, please feel free to raise your hand. We in the contact center space have developed just a number of products that help us become more efficient. So the first and most basic is the ACD, the automatic call distributor, right? So that just delivers the call to the next available agent in some sort of processed way, meaning you might have rules that say if someone's a high dollar customer, put them at the beginning, you can get them answered quickly and so forth. Other products that were out there are dialers. Down in the quality, there's quality management. Those are tools where you listen to agents to make sure that they're doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. So quality management is a very important thing in contact centers. There's also other products around the efficiency. I'm sorry, I'm trying to also read at the same time. Efficiency type tools around computer telephony integration and so forth. And then more recently around optimization like agent activity, workforce management, and so forth. So these are a whole series of products that more or less come up in the last 20 years, basically. And on the surface, they seem pretty bland, but they're actually very important for a contact center to operate efficiently. So if we look at one of the things that came about in the history of contact centers, they started out originally as just, let me answer the phone calls and we'll put bodies on those phone calls. So the next, or one of the first innovations that came up in the contact center space are interactive voice response systems, which we all, I'm sure, are familiar with, right? That basically call deflection is what we call it in the contact center space. What can we do to service that customer in the call flow or put them in, IVR hell so that they, take their time to actually get into the contact center space, because it's much cheaper to do call deflection than it is to actually answer that phone call with an agent. So that was one of the first technologies that came out to make call centers more cost effective. The second is workforce management. Now this one's the one that I'm always fascinated by. Workforce management is this idea where you schedule your people to be on the phone at certain times that match your prediction of what the call volume is. And one of the interesting things in the contact center space, call volume is actually quite predictable week over week. You see a spike on Mondays, you see it go down during the week, and then you see a spike on Fridays, and then it kind of goes down. Those kind of predictions are what this tool does, and this tool literally saves contact centers millions of dollars typically. And the reason being is because if you don't have the call volume and you just hire 50 people or 100 or 1,000 people and they're sitting there not taking phone calls, it costs you a lot of money to pay those people to sit there. So workforce management is a key tool in how we manage those contact centers and how we ensure that they're cost effective. Quality management is the third key tool in the contact center, or primary tool, and that's all about listening to that agent, making sure, like I said, that they do the things that they're supposed to do, that they say hello, that they ask what the problem is, that they repeat the problem back, all this kind of high-level stuff to ensure that that customer leaves the phone call in a happy state, basically, right? That you get the problem correct, that they're stating to you, that you solve the problem or answer whatever their question is, and so forth. So quality management is the two key tools that really drove the contact center space in terms of efficiency. So up till around the 2000s, basically that's what contact centers were, or call centers, I should say. We took phone calls, we routed from customers, we routed them through ACDs to agents. We had workforce management to keep them happy and so forth. So we just, essentially started to really focus on, the efficiencies in the contact center. We started to, understand how to deflect phone calls with IVRs and speech IVRs and so forth. We started to build technology around outsourcing. So rather than spending a lot of money with people in the United States, we spent a lot less money in people in the Philippines. Simple example, a contact center agent in the United States costs about $28, $29 per hour. In the Philippines, back then, they cost about $10 per hour, all in costs. So it's quite a bit of savings, but you paid for it with quality. So then there was a backlash where American consumers were like, well, we don't really like that, so let's bring calls back to the United States, and that's where we got the concept of people working from home, but the problems with that were tremendous also, right? Because you had all these people dispersed. They're typically not your highest self-motivators, so making sure that those people were motivated to get the work done and so forth just became an issue. And that's basically the way the world was up until the 2000s, basically. So then what I call the four horsemen happened, right, in the 2000s that really caused contact centers to have to change into something else, or call centers into something else. That first horseman was the internet, right? Well, we think about the internet, it really came out generally to the public pretty hard in the, in the mid-90s, where businesses were starting to put information on the network, and so that people could go out and look at that. But consumers typically didn't really know about the internet or really use it that much in the mid-90s. The second horseman was Google. So Google came along and said, you know what, people can jump on the internet, and if you know web addresses and stuff like that, you can find information. But Google is the first kind of site that came along and said, you know what, we're going to crawl everything so that a customer can ask a question and it'll point them to a website, right? I mean, to us, that seems obvious, but back in the, the early 90s, the late 90s, that was not something that was obvious. And that just really took off. What that did now is it started creating people who had the ability to find out information for themselves and then use that information against the vendors, right? So if someone had a flip phone I think we remember those things, right? They had a flip phone. They would go on a website, they would see some feature on the flip phone, and then they would call AT&T and say, why doesn't my flip phone do this? So it started to drive up call volume in AT&T for these flip phones, which of course AT&T didn't actually support that flip phone, but it started to create these issues where customers were discovering information themselves and calling companies to ask questions. The third horseman, believe it or not, from my perspective, is Amazon. And the reason it's Amazon is because Amazon really created this concept that I could jump on the internet and I could buy something and it would come my way, right? That started to really change the way people started interacting with business on the internet. I mean, up to this point in the 90s, if you wanted to book a flight someplace, you either called Delta Airlines on the phone or you went into a travel agent and so forth. But now, with the internet really taking off and people really starting to understand these ideas of being able to buy things on Amazon and have them delivered to you, books originally, it just kind of started changing, people's mindset about how they interact with businesses. And so businesses started to have to actually start putting up websites to allow customers to order things or to allow customers to add questions. All of those three things basically drove up call volume in the contact centers. Because in those days, a lot of you I'm sure remember, the website wasn't that clear. So you get someplace and you're like, oh, heck with it, and they'd make a phone call. So volumes in contact centers just started creeping up tremendously. So what that resulted in is then, call centers started to have to deal with a heck of a lot more stuff, right? And again, businesses don't like spending money on call centers. So businesses say, oh, by the way, you have to handle all this additional stuff that I've got up here, but we're not going to pay for it. You have to figure out how to do this without us giving us additional revenue and so forth. So handling things like e-commerce or web chatting or texting and so forth. So all these kind of technologies were flying at the contact centers in the early to mid 2000s. Now that doesn't seem long ago, but remember I was talking about that acceleration of how we as a society have become disconnected, and these are the things that are driving for it. Now, one of the things you noticed, as I said 4 horsemen, and I only showed you 3. So the 4th horseman was actually social media. So Facebook and Twitter. And that is a big horseman when it comes to contact centers. Contact centers were changed significantly when Facebook and Twitter came out, right? Facebook only came out in 2007, if I remember, somewhere in there. So it's only been about 10 years. And that time, Facebook and Twitter have put tremendous amount of pressure on contact centers. Basically, they have expanded social interactions. And what I mean by that is, before Facebook and Twitter, what'd you do? You knew your neighbors and you knew the people that you worked with. So if you went on Delta Airlines and someone threw your guitar on the tarmac, you complained to your friends. Or you might call up Delta and say, you know what, they threw my guitar, and that's it. But with social interactions, not only you can now start talking to lots of people around you, right? So your connections have connections. So now when you make a complaint on Twitter or Facebook, that complaint isn't just to your 10 closest friends. It's to your 10 closest friends who have 10 or 100 friends, plus the other 100 people that you're friends with and you don't know why you're friends with. They just friended you for some reason. I know I've got a lot of that myself. But you can see how quickly that expanded what's going on in the social space. And so that created this situation like I was talking about, is the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? We're all familiar with that, right? Basically, everyone in this room somehow, through 6 different connections, is related to Kevin Bacon type thing. What that implies then is that, you're no longer geographically isolated, right? So if you have a problem with some company like Delta Airlines, it's not just the people in your local neighborhood within 200 feet of your house. Now it's across the globe. So when you make a complaint, it goes across the globe like this. You're no longer, publishing has gone by. So in the past, if someone's guitar got thrown on the ground, someone write a newspaper article about it, that newspaper article got published a few days later, a week later, or so forth, and then some people read it outside of your geographic area, but that was about the extent of it. But with Twitter, you take a picture, you put it on there and say, Delta just threw my guitar on the ground, and there's 3 million people that are now complaining at Delta, right? Next is information control is gone. So before, someone threw your guitar on the ground, you called Delta, and Delta would handle you. Now, you throw it on the ground, you say, Delta, what the heck? And so that control of that story is completely out of control. And that includes false information, right? Certainly in our day and age that we live up. So, I mean, that information, whether it's true or not, depends on how you look at it, right? So someone might see their bag being thrown on the ground, and to them, that's like a really bad thing. But for Delta or someone else, that just may be how things work. You take bags off the cart and you put them on the ground, right? And so it's that perception that's just like incredibly difficult. And that's the speed of how fast bad ideas or brands can just be impacted. Now, in the past, this was handled by marketing groups. Typically, right? So typically when Twitter and Facebook came out, the marketing team just, they monitored or they posted things on Twitter. But we've gotten to this age now where, the brand can be impacted very quickly, as in minutes, right? And so it was impossible for marketing organizations and other organizations to just be able to keep up with that. So in the past, marketing, or brand was just around your TV ads, Delta Airlines, the greatest thing to fly on, or your print ads or so forth, or even web advertising. But that's what people think you are, right? So what I mean by that is that you can put out your brand and you can work on your brand, and so people might think, oh, this great thing about Delta Airlines, but as soon as you do something wrong, right? Even if it's perceived as being something wrong, like someone's booked in a seat and they get in the wrong seat and the flight attendant asks them to move to their proper seat, they may perceive that as a slight, start twittering that Twitter goes across the globe, and the next thing you know, the CEO of Delta Airlines is in trouble basically because they have bad customer service because of that one tweet. Now think about that. Delta Airlines today, on any one day, has 25, 30,000 flights in the air, okay? But here the CEO is getting his ass handed to him because of one person on one flight sat in the wrong seat, right? So that's the kind of things that we're dealing with today. And along that same vein, it's easier to kill your brand than it is to build your brand. Because that tweet of that passenger having to move went all over the world like that. And then as soon as the CEO rectifies it and says he's sorry or whatever they do, that tweet doesn't go anywhere because no one's interested in retweeting, good stuff. They're only interested in tweeting the bad stuff. And that's actually within our human nature to do that. So outrage and false information, like I was saying, that spreads way faster than good and positive information. It's just the nature of who we are as a species, unfortunately, right now. Certainly, if you're on Twitter, that's the nature. Maybe not all of us. So only the contact centers can handle this kind of situation that we're in today. And the reason only contact centers can do is because they're there, right? They've got people that are on the phones waiting. They've got people that are monitoring what's going on in the world. So only in contact centers. So in the last 5 years or so, Twitter, Facebook, other social media is being handled now via contact centers as opposed to the marketing organizations, because everyone thought marketing could handle it really easily. But instead, what you need now is a whole set of tools and resources to help you react So in the past, contact centers were about taking phone calls, waiting for a customer to call you. Now it's about you have to react. And if you don't react quick enough, so in the case of this person being moved and they send out a tweet, Delta Airlines has a team that will actually identify those types of tweets and try to DM that person directly to stop the wave, basically, from spreading across the world. So you have to start being proactive. And contact centers have the technology. Remember that workforce management stuff I was talking about, the quality management stuff I was talking about? Those kind of tools have morphed now to also monitor the social media spaces. So in this case here, a lot of large businesses monitor for keywords that mention them or mention things in their industry so that they can make sure that there isn't a wave coming. And you can literally, I've seen it before, you can literally see in the case of an airline where just kind of chatter about the airline is like this, and then all of something happens with a competitor, not the airline that I was working with, but a competitor, and it just starts. So not only does the competitor have to respond to whatever's causing this wave, but you as an airline, since it's your industry, also have to respond to it to prevent your customers and people who may not even be your customers to really damaging your brand. So the world is now moving at just an incredible pace, quite frankly. And what that's led to is what we call the what I call the oh crap moment. What the oh crap moment is that if you look at call volumes or interactions, that's what the line on the top is. Interactions between businesses and consumers have basically started to skyrocket through 2015. That line is going to start going straight up. And the reason that line is going to start going straight up is Alexa, right? IoT, IoT devices. We are starting to connect our entire life so that we can just basically, call out for whatever our desire is. So in the case of Alexa, hey Alexa, what's my credit card balance? Today, those skills have to be set up in advance, but that's going away soon, right? Where you'll just be able to talk to Alexa and it'll figure out whatever the heck you need. How it does that is by reaching into these businesses' databases and information to understand what you're asking and why potentially you're asking it. As a side note, I like to tell this story. When I was at SRI, the guy who actually invented the Alexa hardware was there doing another startup. And he wasn't responsible for the AI part of it, just the tube with the speakers and the microphones. And one of the cool things that he did is they went and they showed Jeff, if you take 6 Alexas and you put them in an empty room, and then you go up to a wall, doesn't matter, any wall in the room, and you scratch on the wall letters, they could actually put on a computer screen what you're writing, sort of thing. And the reason they did, or how they did it, is basically the triangulation of these 6 Alexas would listen to the sound of you scratching, and based on the different angles and timing, they could tell what letters you're writing on the wall and stuff like that. That's the kind of technology that exists in the Alexa system. And I made a joke with him. I said, wow, that's pretty wild. I said, yeah, I really want to meet some people at Amazon because I got this idea of tying contact centers with the Alexa together. So I could just say, hey, Alexa, and Alexa, I have a problem with my refrigerator. And Alexa could say, well, what's your manufacturer, right? And he looked at me and said, well, why would I want to ask what the manufacturer is? I'm like, well, how else are you going to find out? And he said, well, Alexa's listening. They can tell what kind of refrigerator you have based on the noise that your motor makes, sort of thing, sitting in your kitchen. So, the advance of technology is just amazing, basically, and it's skyrocketing. And if you think about the number of interactions we're talking about here, we're just not going to have enough people in the world to handle all these interactions. And that's where my love comes in, my new love, which is conversational AI is going to save us all. So I know a lot of people have heard a lot of stories about AI this, AI that. AI is amazing technology. in that for an old guy like me, I'm an old assembly language programmer from way back when in the 70s. So I was a kid then, just saying. But as a programmer, you're always thinking in terms of if this, then that, right? AI is totally different. AI is about a series of probabilistic, if I can pronounce it properly, algorithms that you teach. And you say, hey, AI, if this, and AI says, well, maybe this, or maybe that. It's not like an if-then scenario. So it's a totally different way of thinking about the world. Now, one of the things we always have to understand is that if someone says to you AI, that's actually a really broad term, right? I mean, AI encompasses a lot of things. AI is this, sub-tenets of it are really focused around machine learning and deep learning algorithms. They're a common set of algorithms. But what's interesting about them is that in the case of machine learning, you teach the AI by giving it hundreds or thousands of pictures of cats. Have any of you guys ever heard of the cat experiment at Google? Yeah. So the cat experiment at Google was Google wanted to know if they could teach an AI about cats. So they took literally tens of millions of pictures of cats off the internet, and they fed it into this AI. They didn't tell it what it was, and eventually the AI came back and said, I see this thing. What is this thing? And it was a cat. So now you could just give it a picture of whatever, and it would say, yep, I see two cats. I see one cat walking away. I see one cat climbing. It can tell you all this information without someone at Google programming something that says, if cat is walking away, then say cat walking away. It learned it itself, basically. So those are the kind of technologies that are coming at us, and they're coming at us fast. Some of the sub areas are visual recognition, so being able to look at a picture, like I said, voice transcription. So, speech to text or transcription now has become phenomenal. I mean, yep, I got to go. 5 minutes? Oh, sorry, keep talking. So I'll go a little bit faster. That technology is being combined together in really complex systems. So, if you think about a Google car is not, just one AI. It's a whole bunch of subset of AI. It's kind of like your brain. It's got an AI that does visual recognition. It's got an AI that understands different types of scenarios that you're running through that were trained. It's got LiDAR, which is a radar or a laser system for imaging the environment. So it's just a whole series of technologies. Now, why does that apply in the contact centers? Or why is that important in the contact centers? Is that today we're starting to apply AI technology in the contact centers to help the agents move through calls much faster, basically. So in the black box here, real quick, you can see where, during a conversation, AI is pointing out things to the agents, things that they might respond with, and so forth. The reason I'm bringing all this up on AI about solving the problems of the world is because, AI is going to replace people, because that speech to text technology I'm talking to right now, so transcription is around 98% accuracy depending upon what model you use. So that's pretty darn accurate. The same is true with Alexa, is that with that technology, we'll be able to listen to a phone call and be able to actually understand what the heck that customer is saying to us, right? So that if a customer wants information 24/7, they can go to that Alexa. They can ask that question. What the scary thing is, though, is there's now AI technology that's just come out that can actually reproduce your voice and can reproduce it really well. So 20 hours of your voice fed into a system, and someone can sit down on a computer, type any statement they want, like, I hate the world or something like that, and it will actually produce in your voice that utterance. And it's not far away either. The first experiments just came out where the same was true with video. So about 40 hours of video, click, 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 here's a statement, and you'll get yourself saying whatever statement someone wants. And the reason that's interesting in the case of contact centers, you combine that together, and now you've got contact centers that can operate without people, right? And that's why contact centers are going to move from handling brand and so forth to being just knowledge centers, because someone has to actually teach these AIs, right? And that's what contact center agents are going to go and get into. So I think I'm out of time. These guys are poking at me, so and that's why on the knowledge centers, just so you know, a lot of agents will be really focused on doing that knowledge. The last slide I had was just talking about the back to reality, back to the next 5 years. You know, that $24 billion global addressable market is a huge thing for you. So if you as a business are in the UC space and you start thinking about getting into the contact center space with, especially with 2600's contact center platform, there's a tremendous conversion going on right now, which is people are moving from premise-based premise-based contact centers into cloud contact centers. And right now, cloud contact centers have only dipped into that 15 billion seats, or 15 million seats, by about 18 to 20%. So that means there are about 80% of contact center premise installations that are going to go to cloud. So that's a huge opportunity, and that's where the $24 billion comes from. So that's my spiel, and sorry it took so long, and I appreciate you all didn't like run out to lunch right away, so type thing.
Thank you very much, Tom.